All right, Bigfoot Society, I've got the privilege of talking to Mr. Neil Frost today. Neil Frost is an Australian educator, explorer, and writer whose background in science, anthropology, and engineering has taken him from the Blue Mountains of Australia to the highlands of Papua New Guinea. His lifelong curiosity about nature, culture, and the unknown shapes his works and stories. Neil has written this book called Fatfoot, Encounters with a Dooligahl, and it's an autobiographical journey of 50-plus years investigating Australia's 3 marsupial enigmas. And I want to hold this again so you can see that it is what is about 700 pages, Neil.
About a bit more than that, yeah.
It's intense. It's intense. A lot of good stuff in this book. But welcome to the show, Neil. How are you doing today?
I'm going well, thanks. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you for being on the show right now over there in Australia. It's almost 9:30 in the morning. Over here in Iowa, it's about almost 5:30 at night because we got to get that 16-hour time difference to work. But I'm excited to talk to you today. So many things I didn't know about Australia. I thought Australia was just about the Yowie, but there's much, much more going on with it. But Neil, is there anything else that you would want the audience to know about yourself?
I was a teacher. I went to university and did anthropology. I wanted to become an archaeologist originally, but the university I went to didn't have archaeology, so I stuck with anthropology instead. I studied anthropology, and then during term, I would get hold of old cars and do them up and sell them to get money, and use that money to go overseas to New Guinea to study the tribes in Papua New Guinea and throughout Micronesia, Melanesia, because I was interested in them and following my studies. After I had done that, I then went and got a job. I got a job as a teacher because I was bonded. I had a scholarship, so I was committed to having to work for the Department of Education. And they sent me out west, and that's where I had an encounter. One of many. We built our own house. After I finished there, I came back to Sydney, and in the Blue Mountains, we bought a vacant block of land in the middle of nowhere and built our own 2-story wooden house. After we'd done that, we noticed all these weird things were going on in the bush around us. And it wasn't until about 10 years later that we actually realised what it was. And of course, it was the fact that we had the hairy man walking around our property. That caused a lot of trauma for a family, for my wife and I, because we didn't know what we were dealing with. And that motivated me basically to do something about it. So I formed a group called the Octopus. The Octopus was a group of local inhabitants who investigated the activities of these beings in the bush. And the object was simply to not only just report on them and get information about them, but also to help people who had encounters. Because like us, many people have had these encounters are traumatized. They have a lot of trauma. They don't know who to turn to. People realizing very quickly that as soon as you mention the topic, you're in trouble. People it's treated as a taboo topic, and people start to ridicule you. So people become, I suppose we would say, they become very self-aware of this problem, and they tend to self-censor, is probably a better way of saying it. So they don't say anything. They become very introverted as a result of that. So that was our main mission, not only just to study these things and find out about it from an anthropological point of view and also from a zoological point of view, but also to help out the people who had encounters because they were basically suffering. So that's generally it.
That's fantastic. There's so many similarities to what we have to deal with in the U.S. and really North America when it comes down to it, about people having to deal with trauma after having encounters with Bigfoot. And although these things we'll be talking about might be a little different, they might have some similarities as well. And we'll probably talk about that later. But I would think so your first encounter that you had was way back in 1966 in the Blue Mountains. Is that correct?
It was. Originally I was a scout, cub actually. Then I moved up into the Scouts. And at the age of about 11, I think it was, when that occurred, in 1966. And when I went into the Scouts, it happened that we had a 7-day camp in the Blue Mountains. 7 days, 6 nights. And they've been preparing for this for quite a long time. My scout leader, my scout master, was an ex-World War II prisoner of war, a very talented man, a very knowledgeable man. He knew a lot about the Australian environment. And what he didn't know, he went out of his way to find it. So he would learn it from the Aborigines. So we had this camp that was coming up, and other people prepared for the camp as well. So they had the more senior people, the rovers, in the group who used to go there on weekends, and they built a dam, would you believe? It was a curved wall dam. They were basically engineers, some of them were metallurgists, so very knowledgeable blokes. And they built a curved dam that had a pressurised water system for the area. It was an incredible bit of engineering for a remote area. So they built all these facilities in this incredibly remote area, and it was the Grace Valley was what it was, and it's basically a gorge that's 600 metres deep. To get into it, it's a bit of an effort. You've got to walk down these goat tracks and traverse these very difficult sections, very dangerous sections. It wouldn't be allowed today. We wouldn't be allowed to do what we did because the risk of getting injured or killed was very high. But anyway, we went to this area. We set up, and I think it was the second or third night, things started to happen. We started to hear, second night, we started to hear howling on the cliff above us. And of course, the people in the tent I was in, the older blokes started stirring us up, trying to get us terrified. I was only 11. They were 16 to 18-year-olds. So they were working me up a little bit. And it was howling, and I can't describe it really much better than that. It was an unusual sound, very guttural, very loud, and coming 600 metres above us. The very next night, after we'd experienced that, the thing was down in the valley with us. And we had the campsite, had a main campsite where nearly everybody was camped except for my patrol leader, who decided he wanted to have privacy and put us 100 metres further out in the bush by ourselves. As a result of this thing came down into the campsite, it terrorised the main campsite for a considerable period of time. We could hear it. And then it discovered us and came over to our campsite, our tent. When it got to our tent, it started shaking things. So it would shake trees around it, shake the tent, make various noises. And it's probably the early hours of the morning. Eventually, I was so fatigued after basically 2 nights of not being able to sleep like everyone else, I went to sleep. And then I suddenly woke up, startled awake by the sound of something growling in my ear. And what had happened was I was on the end of the tent, and something came up and growled into my left ear. And of course I reacted to that. I flew through the air, and I landed further down the line on 2 other scouts. No one said anything. No one complained. There wasn't a peep out of anyone. And this lasted till dawn. No one said a word until we got up in the morning, when anyone ran around to try and find out what it could have been. So that was a first encounter. Very unusual, incredibly scary. As my neighbour next door said many years later, it was basically a testicle tightening experience. It was so frightening. It really was at really high levels of deadness. So that was my first encounter.
My goodness, that is, wow, what a way to start things off. Do you think that was then an actual Dooligahl that was messing with you guys at that time?
It was either a Dooligahl or a Quinkan. Quinkans are very nasty. They're very aggressive, and this thing was obviously very aggressive. That sort of leans towards a Quinkan. We didn't go outside and have a look because we were too scared to do that, obviously. I did know what we're dealing with anyway. And the other possibility is a Dooligahl. Dooligahls can be, at least males can be aggressive. So it's either Dooligahl male, a large male, or a Quinkan, any one of a number of male or female, really. But I think possibly I'm leaning towards Dooligahl for that one.
Gotcha. Do you think we could take a few minutes maybe talking about what each of the 3 are? The Dooligahl, the Quinkan, and the Junjudee.
Yeah, sure. It's quite apparent. We've got 3 different species here, 3 main species. So the Yowie is really not one generic species. It's a broad range. So you've got 3 types, and they're very distinct. So we have, at the top end of the scale, we have the Quinkan. The Quinkan is an Aboriginal name, again, from far north Queensland, from the rainforests up there. Now, the rainforests up there are extremely dense, and you imagine it's very hard to get through them, so you can hide anything up there, including World War II aircraft that crashed there, and they never found them again. They won't be able to find them. So you have these Quinkan, and they're can be up to about 8-9 feet tall. They're rather slender. They only have 3 digits. So you have 3 fingers and they have 3 toes. And their foot is rather long and extended, so it's like a kangaroo foot. So you have these Quinkan, the larger ones. They tend to be very aggressive. The Aborigines were terrified of them because of the fact they used to eat Aborigines. So particularly their favourite food, according to them, were children. They used to like taking children. The second type is Dooligahl. Dooligahl is the one that we had most experiences with, and the one that we called Fatfoot. Dooligahls are lesser height. They're up at 6 to 7 foot in height. They can be rather aggressive, but see, our one was a female. And we knew it was a female because an Aboriginal elder told me. I won't go into now how we knew that, but he said that you've got a female, and as a consequence, they're a lot more caring and they're not as aggressive. Males can be aggressive. So the female we're lucky having a female because we didn't have as many problems as we could have had. They're 4-toed. We called our one Fatfoot for the simple reason that it obviously sustained an injury to its foot. You've got a cast here to show that's really hard to get right here to be able to see this, but casting shadows on it. But you might be able to notice on this side here, yeah, that's better. Here there's a bulge on the foot, on the outside edge. The foot actually extends down here normally, and it has a bulge on the side here. We suspect that that's due to an injury. After all, if you run around barefoot at high speed in the bush, eventually you're going to injure your foot. So we guess that's what it is, an injury. You can see up here there's a big toe. There's a compression ridge in the middle where the big toe and the lesser toe is here off to the side, and there's 3 of them, have squeezed the soil, forming a ridge, and that's why it's a hollow there. Down the bottom here, you've got the heel. The heel is separate to the main part of the body, so the heel has a gap in it. 4-toed, rather large, and that's why we call it Fatfoot. The last type of the Junjudee. Now, Junjudee is the best way to describe them. The Aborigines describe them politely as mischievous, but they're scheming little bastards. That's what they are. They've got a real attitude to them. They will steal, rob, damage, sabotage, do anything to you that they possibly can because they think it's funny. So there's like a European elf, I suppose. I read stories of those sorts of mischievous things. These things are about 3 to 4 foot high. They're more monkey-like. I've seen that one. I've seen one of these as well. That's probably the difference between the height and then the skin, the fur. They have fur on them, which is more like a horse's fur. It's a very short fur. They have a yellow annulus around each eye, so it makes them very distinctive. What else can I say about them? But that's basically it for a Junjudee. So there are 3 basic types: small, medium, and large, aggressive, mischievous on the bottom end of the scale.
Gotcha. And just to make sure I get this, and these are all included under the umbrella of Yowie then? Is that right?
Yeah, because of the stories, isn't it? Yeah, you have to try and differentiate them from the stories. But yeah, they are included under one umbrella.
Okay, gotcha. So when, let's say over here in America, if we hear Yowie stories from Australia, they could actually be about one of these 3 creatures. Yes. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so you have to listen carefully to the story to figure out which one they're talking about. The main thing, of course, is they're all fast, so that makes it hard to differentiate. They all move incredibly fast, like your Bigfoot. 40 kilometres an hour is what we've clocked them at high speed. So 40 k's is pretty fast. They run through bush, not around it. They just tear through the undergrowth. Don't seem to worry about it too much. What else about things? That's probably the main differences what you hear. And then you get stories of monkeys, monkey-like things, or kids. Some people confuse the Junjudee with children. So they think they're childlike because they have small feet. They have 5 toes. So you've got 5 toes, so they can be confused with human children. And that's people confuse them with, generally speaking. So that's 3 basic types.
When people have visual sightings of, let's say, the Dooligahl, do they say it looks more like a human or some kind of ape, or is it some weird mixture?
In the case of Dooligahl, most people, of course, go to the thing that they're most familiar with, and they say it's Bigfoot. So nearly invariably, they say, we saw Bigfoot. That's the most common description. So they're very similar in appearance to a Bigfoot, as you would call them. But clearly they're not the same. If you get delved into the fine details, there are distinct differences between them. So in the case of our ones, we have 4 toes on Dooligahl. I think a Bigfoot typically has 5, although there are reports of different toes, I think, aren't there, with some of them? Yeah. So
absolutely, yeah. Different regions of the U.S., for example, like Southeast Alaska, there's 4-toed ones that are reported, but for the most part, yeah, it would be 5 toes. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Also, something I wanted to talk about when laying the groundwork for what these 3 creatures are. So they are also looked at as marsupials, right?
No, I'm the only one.
Oh, no.
Basically, he says they're marsupial. Everyone else says that they're like Bigfoot and they're placentals. Now, humans are placentals, and for the benefit of people who are not too sure, that means that they have a placenta. So babies are born internally in the mother, and they give birth to it. That's a placental. Marsupials, the babies are, or the joeys, when they're born, they travel from the birth canal up the mother's belly, through the fur, and attached to the nipple. And so they grow up externally and that's why they're called marsupials, because it comes from the Latin word marsupium. So they have an external womb, you might say. So that's the difference between them. It's the way in which the babies are born.
That's fascinating. So all 3 of these would be considered placentals then, is what it sounds like.
No, all 3 of these are regarded as marsupial.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. Bigfoot, placental, these 3 that we have in Australia here, I would argue they're marsupial, but unfortunately most people here think that these things are also placentals like Bigfoot. So most Australians have the object that because they look similar to Bigfoot, they are Bigfoot, so therefore they're similar in every way. They're basically placental animals, but there's the things that separate them from placentals that makes them a bit more interesting. Probably the best thing to say about them is like with us, we have flat pink nails.
Mm-hmm.
Other hominids like us, like apes and chimpanzees, also have flat pink nails, and that's how you tell we're a hominid. With these things, no. They have black claws on their hands and feet. Now that by itself, that one particular thing just by itself tells you they're not related to humans in any regard. So they've got black claws, they're flat, they're not flat nailed, so there's something weird about them straight away. Sorry?
Also, Quinkan does a weird thing where it'll make loud thumping noises, correct?
Yeah. The thing about thumping is that's a characteristic of kangaroos. Kangaroos, I think it's 49 out of 52 species, from memory, of kangaroo foot thump. And foot thumping is used by them. It's ultrasound, so you thump your foot, and any other kangaroo in the area will hear that noise and think there's danger in the area, there's a predator around, or it might be some other reason they're foot thumped for. So kangaroos typically do that particular behaviour. Now, the interesting thing is that the Dooligahl also foot thumps. And that was the problem we used to have with ours, is that it would come around at night time and it would announce its presence by foot thumping. So, in fact, it foot thumps, kangaroos foot thumps, means there's a possible link there with kangaroos. I mean, there's quite a number of them, but that's yet another one. It's the foot thump. The Junjudee don't foot thump. They hit sticks. So they get sticks and they belt things. They belt trees with a stick, which I think what your Bigfoot does also.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
How far back do your historical records of these three go back in Australia?
When you're talking historical records, you're talking about Aboriginal history.
Oh,
now,
sure. So, yeah.
They're oral histories. They're not written histories. So you're talking about European history if you're talking about that sort of history. But in terms of the Aborigines, their history of that, their oral history of these things goes back a long time. One of the classic things they will say to you is they were here before us, but they're not the same as us. I've heard that a few times. Oral histories are pretty much discounted too much. You know, I'm originally an anthropologist, and I used to rely a lot on oral histories. But one thing which, in studying this, which really amazed me were oral histories of past geological events in Australia. And one particular one was a group of Aboriginal ladies in Tasmania, which is down the bottom of Australia, which is separate from Australia by the Bass Straits. It's got water between them. Now, that separated 12,000 years ago. Yet these Aboriginal ladies used to talk about their mothers distant, their ancestral mothers who used to walk from Tasmania to Victoria across this area on dry land. Now, that's an example of a 12,000-year-old memory. There's quite a number of examples like that, but I found that fascinating. People say, how can you possibly have an old history like this thing that's been preserved over that period of time? I think that's one example at least where it's been the case. So, yeah.
As an anthropologist, have you had the opportunity to interview Aboriginals about stories regarding these from their oral history? Yeah. When
we originally had our first encounter here at our house, and we were quite terrified about it, we started to try and find people who would be able to help us. And in the first 24, 48 hours, we knew of no one. So we mentioned it to a few friends, and basically they looked us sideways just to say what's wrong or what drugs are you on. So we realised that wasn't a line to pursue. We then thought about using our neighbour. Our neighbour was a biker, an ex-con. He was a very tough man, and he was really good. We're glad we spoke to him because he was prepared to give us physical support and backup on this. But the Aborigines, when we asked them, because we're teachers, we went to the Department of Education and spoke to Aboriginal consultants, and they're always a little bit shy about talking about it. And we said to them, I'd like to talk to you about the yowie. And they'll say, what are you talking about? I said, we're talking about the yowie. I said, what do you mean? I said, the hairy man. And they say, okay, what do you know about the hairy man? I said, they've got red eyes. And they say, okay, what else do you know? I said, they run very fast. I said, all right, we'll talk to you. So you've got to pass the test. You've got to actually be able to pass the test before they get the help out of really that stage. So the information they had, the guy that we mainly relied on was a guy called Merv. Merv was regarded as the yowie expert in Aboriginal society down the south coast of New South Wales. Merv knew everything. When we first had this problem, when we spoke to Merv, Merv said, you've recently built a house, have you? And we said, yes, we have. And I said, how do you know this? He's like a shaman. And he said, there are plenty of tracks around your land when you built. I said, yes, there were. I said, okay. Did you build your house across any of these tracks? Yes, we did. He said, tell me, how far from the swamp are you? I said, about 40 metres. About 40 metres from the swamp. And he said, after a lengthy process, he then said, do you have any children? And I said, yes. He said, what ages are they? And I said, that time it was 2.5 and 6 months. I can't remember exactly. But they were very young kids. And I said, male and female. And then Merv said to him, this is very important. He said, have you ever lost any children's clothing? I said, what do you mean lost children's clothing? I said, I mean from the clothesline. You put clothes out at night to dry and you come back and they're not there. I said, no. But I tell you what, I have found children's clothing in the swamp. And he said, there you go, you've got a female, straight up. And the reason is his argument after questioning him afterwards why that was the case. He said because with Dooligahl, they like to teach their joeys what humans are like and various other things like normal parents do. So he said females will go and steal things like clothing from the clothesline and take it to the joeys and let them sniff it and basically tell them this is what a human smells like. So this is pretty amazing. So he was telling us all these sort of stories. And Merv said to me, this is very worrying. You need to be careful now because it means you've got a Dooligahl in the area. And he says they take children. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no, they will take children. And I said, what to eat? And he said, well, put it this way. He said, you might lose a child during the night and the chances are you probably won't see it again. And that was really frightening. So I said, how do you know, Merv, how do you know all this stuff? And he said to me, back in the 40 years ago or something, or 30 years ago, he said, I used to take Aboriginal children out into the bush to hide them because we had a bad practice here in Australia of taking children. The government had practice of taking children away from their parents. Same with, I think, with America, with the Indians. They used to take the children away and put them in foster homes and bring them up as whites. So he said, we used to take our kids out in the middle of the bush to hide them from the government men. And he said, on one occasion in particular, we were all the blokes, because the men used to mainly do that, the men would be sitting around the campfire and the children would be playing in the light at night time. And he said, one night we had a Dooligahl came into the campsite very fast, picked up a child and kept on going. It says that all the men instinctively went and grabbed their weapons and pursued after it. And he said, apart from the fact the kid was screaming away, they followed it during the night until dawn. He said it was a long process. And when they got at dawn, they came to an area which was a big clearing. And he said you could hear the Dooligahl off in the distance. So all the men formed a line. He said we formed a line across the clearing and we all raised our spears and shook them, which he said it tells them we're going to go to war with you. That was a sign for going to war. So he said what happened then was the child, he came out in the clearing, he put the child down and walked back in. We got the kid back. Said, that's how I know. I thought, that is amazing. But there's plenty of stories. You have stories of European women who wrote their autobiographies too. And one woman in the 1840s wrote a story about, she reckoned how bad the Aboriginal women were. They weren't very good mothers, she said, because you'd go into a camp, and it's in the 1840s, she said there'll be Aboriginal kids playing, and then you'll come back a few weeks or a month later or 2 months or whatever it was, and one of the kids would be gone. So whatever happened to this kid? And the mothers would say, a Dooligahl took it, or whatever the name of the local hairy man was from that area. And this woman in particular, Elizabeth, whatever it was, she said these women were very bad mothers because they would lose their children and then blame it on something like a magical evil spirit took their kids. In fact, she said, I think it's because they just simply don't look after their kids. And there's other examples of stories like that too, but that's one that sticks in my mind about how badly they think they treated them.
Wow, so it's a thing. It's taken very serious in the cultures over there, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah. Even today, in the Northern Territory, for example, you've got cases where a lot of people still living traditionally for a variety of reasons. They live traditionally. And he said the usual arrangement is you have a campfire in the middle. If you haven't got a building, you have a campfire in the middle of the clearing. You clear a long way around, they used to say. You have the young children on the inner circle, followed by the women on the immediate circle, and then the men on the outer circle. Outside of that, you have then 44-gallon drums, metal drums, and they had put logs in it and burned them. He said these are the common name up there for them is they have these large logs and they call them all-nighters because they burn all night. And the thing is, the light keeps them away. And the interesting thing about light is it's like a moth. A light does two things with Dooligahl in particular. It attracts them to the site because they see a light in the distance. They're dying to find out why it is. So they'll come and have a look and they'll stare and just observe. But they won't go any closer because while the lights are there, it means they're blinded because they're primarily nocturnal. They have night vision, which is very badly wiped out if they start staring at a burning fire. So the lights in particular have a double-edged sword. And that was the first bit of advice we were given by the Parramatta Aboriginal Land Council when we had a problem, was the Aboriginal guy said to me, you're going to laugh at this. He said, we spoke to the Aboriginal Land Council last night and got their advice. He said, the decision's out. Half the men decided that you turn all your lights off, and the other half of the men said, you turn all your lights on. So that was the typical response, because it is a double-edged sword. But
right.
They are very light sensitive because they're nocturnal, and you tend to have a problem with it. So that's what happens with camping. I always give advice to people who have Dooligahl around their house is the best thing you can do is clear around your house and then put motion sensing lights on each corner of your house. When they come on, they're blind to it, and you'll keep them away for a short period of time. Because what happens, because they're very intelligent, they're not stupid, is that they learn, and they learn very quickly. And the end result of that is that they'll find some way of getting around the problem. And that can involve, say, stalking using trees as cover, or in the case of a doctor up here, a surgeon and a trauma neurosurgeon, he said at his place that they had learnt to travel along the edge of the wall. So he had these lights on the eaves overhead, and he said they would travel along the eaves of his house to get to his door to look at him or through his window to see what he was doing at 2:00 in the morning. And he knew what he was doing. He was studying for his latest degree. So he said he had these things coming around, but they learned to do that. Junjudee, just to jump to a different Yowie, Junjudee, on the other hand, are more destructive. What they do is that if they find lights, motion sensing lights, they'll go out of their way to deactivate them. With our case here, they started off by pushing the lights down to the ground so they wouldn't light the area up. And then later on, they went to getting a stick and ramming it in through the passive infrared sensor, wheeling it around until it's totally demolished. So they do. The other thing they did too was disconnect the power. So these things, particularly things like what they do is they're in the bush day and night. Merv told us that. Don't think they're not around during the day. So during the day, they're sitting there and you're putting up motion sensing lights and they're watching what you're doing, and they're watching very closely. And they realise that whatever that thing is on the side that's hanging down there is an important component. And they'll go and investigate and they'll muck around with it, and they'll find out that by doing that, it will stop the lights from working.
My goodness, there's so many similarities. It's wild between what we're experiencing over here and what you all have experienced over there. Something that is...
Jump in there for a second.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, that's an important, very important point, because that's what people say all the time. The similarities, the behaviours in particular between Yowie, the three types of Yowie, and the American Bigfoot are so close, they must be the same animal. But they're not. They just have the same behaviours, which perhaps we'll get onto in more depth later on. But that's an important point you mentioned.
It is very... I remember reading through your book, and I was like, it's very weird because, yeah, as you just stated, it doesn't look the same. Like, it's different, but it acts similar. Do you guys get reports of there being... Some people over here report there being a form of telepathic communication. Is that anything that's reported between these three and humans over there?
No, but not some people talk about it, but not many.
Okay.
The main thing is, I think that they're so smart. That's why they appear to be telepathic.
Gotcha.
If you're walking towards them with a camera and they know what a camera is, they run away. They're actually communicating to you. We used to have them communicate back to us. For example, Fatfoot used to go, mook, 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 which I think was a warning. because one time I went mook mook back to her and she got upset and yelled it back at me. And then the third time I had to go back as far as I could, and she just bellowed at me. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Yeah, telepathic, but I think they rely pretty heavily still on voice.
Okay,
to communicate. But the thing is that they've learned things like they have a very strong understanding of how people work. One of my favourite things with Fatfoot was, and with new people who come into the area, was that they would break a branch off a tree. So you have a large branch, large diameter branch, and put the hand on it and just break it off because they're very powerful. And then everybody who hears this will say, there's something wrong with that sound. You think about it. Then after you've thought about it for a while, you realise what it is. You didn't hear the branch hit the ground. You just hear the branch snap and then silence. And then you put it 2 and 2 together and you go, that was a deliberate branch being broken off. Now that's messing with your mind. They do things like that. Another example might be, for example, if you're tracking one, they'll throw a branch or a rock in front of you, the old thing, and then it goes back in front, and then they'll turn around and go the opposite way. It's a pretty simple one. But
it's so similar, Neil. It's crazy. The behavior is very similar. I can't get over it.
They're both intelligent. That's the reason why.
Yeah, absolutely. Over the years, have you had any visual sightings yourself of any of the three?
Yeah, I had a really good daytime sighting of a Junjudee, which I drew a picture of, and it's in the book. And it turned out that there was another daytime sighting by a woman 150 years ago, and our two descriptions matched. That was the one with the face, almost human-like face, but it has 2 yellow rings around the eyes. So daylight savings, I've had them with Fatfoot, but in the early days mainly, because Fatfoot in the early days didn't realise what our limitations were, and we didn't realise what her limitations were either. So we had a greater chance of having a visual encounter. As the days and weeks and months and years went by, the chances of having an encounter diminished rapidly. The only thing is that recently, Fatfoot finally died, because I've made predictions about her death several times. She finally died in February 2023. And the reason why she died, I'm sure she died on that occasion, because I had thought I'd prophesied her dying earlier, was because of the fact that one night we had some foot thumping, but I listened to it was in the house, and I said to Sandy, well, this foot thumping is very soft. It's almost pathetic, like it's struggling to do it. And then after that, we never saw Fatfoot ever again. So I think she was coming up to say goodbye. So there's too much detail here to try and cover everything. But in the case of the foot thumping, what we would do was we had to respond. So when she used to do the foot thump like this, and then she'd do it every minute, really loud, if I didn't respond, she would keep on doing that all night. And the response had to be, in our case, was turning the outside light on and off 3 times. Click it on, off, and then she would stop doing it. Because that was a signal to her to say, I've heard what you've said, and I'm not coming outside, because we used to go out and play with her. That was the main thing with using signals. There's something else I was going to tell you. I forgot it.
I think it's a good thing. You alluded to it, is that in this book, there's so much detail. We're not going to cover even a fraction of it in this interview. There is so much information in this book. I would really recommend that the listeners pick up a copy of it, and I'll have how to do that in the description. But it's an incredible book. You'll learn a lot about what's going on over there in Australia. These 3 creatures, are they only found in Australia, or are they found in other places as well in the region?
I have one researcher that I respect, and he said he saw one in New Guinea, which makes sense because New Guinea was 12,000 years ago again, was attached to Australia at Queensland. They were attached like Tasmania was. So there's no reason why they shouldn't have gone into New Guinea. The only difference might be the fact that these things are very heat sensitive. They don't like hot weather, probably like your Bigfoot. They like to live in high mountains and cool areas. That's why they live in our Great Dividing Range here, because they go down the plains. It's not a nice thing for them. They prefer to get cool. Whether there are other places, they have ranges, like, for example, Quinkan, because of their size and because they're rainforests. It seems like they're rainforest animals. You only really find them on the east coast of Australia and the mountain ranges. Dooligahl are found from Western Australia to Eastern Australia. They're basically everywhere, and same with Junjudee. So there are certain limitations with them, but yeah. What else? Yeah, that's about it for that.
Do you have any favorite investigations that come to mind over the years where you've been brought into trying to figure out what's happening with it, or maybe talking to a person that's having interactions with any of the three that we're talking about today?
Yeah, once again, so many, because we used to have, with the Octopus, we'd have reports, probably 3 a week.
Wow.
Coming in. There wasn't any shortage. People used to say, how can you have 3 a week? These things, first of all, they don't exist. And secondly, how can you have so many reports of them? I said, these people they don't know each other. They just report to members of the Octopus, and the Octopus members ring me up and say, this is what happened last night. I'd hop in the car and I'd drive down and I'd interview the poor buggers, because half the time they'd be absolutely terrified. That, for example, I think it was an old woman who went outside and she turned on the light, and there was a big fella, big hairy man standing there, and she said she could see his penis. So she was absolutely terrified by the whole process. There were other reports too that there's no end to them. My favourite one probably is the one that happened to me in the early days, or quite a number of them. But one was when I was out living in the bush. I was out on a wheat and sheep station, 15,000 acres, no one around. And one night I just come back from my holidays, and I came back and I found that my pigeon coop, which I had built underneath the water tank, all the pigeons were dead because the water tank had collapsed for some reason and killed the birds, and some got out, and the whole area was written off. So I spoke to Ned, the farmer, and I said, look, Ned, you can do something about the water supply. We haven't got any water again. So Ned was a good bloke. He went and bought a brand new concrete tank, and came with a bobcat the next morning and cleared the area, got rid of all the rubbish, put a brand new water tank in, and then carted some water from in town in and filled up our water tanks. Oh, thanks, Ned, you're a great bloke. That night, I was woken up approaching midnight to the sound of something outside. Now, this house was a double brick house. It was a farmhouse. It's built solidly, shall we say, and it was to keep the heat out and various other things, very high ceilings, and it's still I could hear through the bricks. And I thought, whatever this is big, and I didn't realise, hadn't made the connection. And then I heard footsteps on the wooden veranda. Now, the footsteps were very heavy because the floorboards, which were pretty solid, the hardwood floorboards, started to creak. Now, look, they normally didn't creak at all. They wouldn't have any creak. And then the next sound was, it sounded like whatever was coming up to my window. So I slid myself up against the window because I was sleeping on the floor, and then gradually sat up in bed. And as soon as I did, this thing took off, whatever it was, and ran across the veranda and into the paddocks. As a result of that, I thought, gee, this sounded really scary, like it was a big person, because it was definitely on 2 legs. It wasn't a sheep or anything like that. So I ran into the kitchen, turned every light on. I drew out 2 kitchen knives and held them, and then rang the manual exchange to ring up. And I spoke to one of my students and said, get everyone over here, there's something going on. I need some help now. So I went and stood out in the paddock with 2 knives with all the lights on. Just kept turning around to make sure nothing was sneaking up on me. And eventually the other teachers arrived and relieved me. And then when they put their cars around where we were and turned the high beams on, all we could see were these muddy footprints going up onto the veranda and then down off the other side. Once again, at that stage, I wasn't aware of these things. I wasn't meowy aware. I still thought maybe this is an intruder because they were footprints, weird footprints, but they were still footprints. And I went and spoke to all the people in the town. I wanted to go to the pub. There's nothing else to do. I mean, go to the pub, nothing to do, and all day to do it. And so I'd go to the pub and talk to them. And the people who talked most about it were the truck drivers. The truck drivers would say, they'll be driving along, these are the areas you don't go through. Because he said they'd run across in front of their trucks during the night. He said they'd do a dash. This big hairy thing would just belt across in front of their trucks. Or they'd get out and urinate and turn around and there's something standing behind them, or they'd be asleep in the truck and then something would grab hold of their truck. Is that prime mover, mind you, big rig, and they would shake the truck and do a runner. These were the quite common things. That started to make me think, maybe there's something in this. I need to investigate this a bit more. So that was probably one that was stuck out pretty well. Probably the ultimate scary one for me was one night after Ian and I, my neighbour, my biker neighbour, had been out chasing Fatfoot through the scrub. And we got back about midnight and we were sitting on the veranda and Ian said, look, I'm going to have to go to bed because I've got to go to work. And I start work in the morning. I said, okay, I'll see you later. So I sat up by myself and I thought, I'm going to sit out here. I'm going to test Fatfoot's stamina in terms of how long it can put up with me teasing her. So I moved the table up against the edge of the veranda in the moonlight and the chair, went inside, got a pack of smokes, 6-pack of beer, put it on the table and just sat there. So I had a smoke and had a beer and this went on for quite a while. And as time's going by, I'm thinking, no, nothing much is going to happen here. So I get the table and I'll drag it further across into the moonlight so they can see me clearly. And then eventually, after this really long period of doing this thing, Fatfoot spat the dummy. And she got up and she shook these trees. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Australian trees, but they're hardwoods and they are very solid trees. And this was only an 8-inch diameter tree. It wasn't like a pine tree. It was 8 inches diameter, but very solid. And in the moonlight, I could see with this Australian eucalypt tree whipping through a 90-degree arc like this. And then it moved across to another one and did the same. And then it kept them both going. Must have been running around, pushing all the trees to keep the motion up amongst the whole lot of them. And then it stormed off down into the valley and all the dogs erupted. So I went down to the swamp to try and encourage her and say, I'm sorry I didn't mean to stir you up like that. She wouldn't come back. She just spat it. And all I could hear was the dogs barking down the valley for the next 5 or 10 minutes. But just emphasise how strong this animal was, incredibly strong. To be able to do that to the trees, because next morning I went to the trees, you could see where he had been pushing on the tree. But I put my weight behind it. I could barely do it if I started rocking it. I could barely get a movement up, but nowhere near what Fatfoot could do. And I thought that's a scary animal.
That is extremely intense.
It's like with me. After that, things like that scared me so much. I used to carry a tomahawk down the back of my trousers. And Ian and I would go out yowie hunting at the night time. And then Ian would say, he was a stirrer, he would say, now what do you got the tomahawk down the back of your trousers for? I said, in case we need it, in case we need to self-defend. He said, you're wasting your time. You're absolutely wasting your time because if you use that tomahawk on Fatfoot, all you're going to do is get a cranky. He said, you're better off in that case than to use the tomahawk on yourself because it'll be a lot quicker and a lot less painful.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
Advice.
Oh, my goodness. Have there ever been any videos taken of Fatfoot over the years?
Yeah. On page 2, I think, of the book, there's a black and white photograph. I made my own game camera because back in those days, you couldn't get a game camera. So you had to make your own if you wanted one. So I made one using a film camera, high-speed film, car starter motor, solenoid off that, connected the cable release onto the end of that, a car battery, a passive infrared sensor, and some flood lamps. So what happened is anything went through the standard beam of the passive infrared, it would set off the lights, and then it would set off the car solenoid on starter motor. You'll push the cable and take one photograph per night. And doing that, I managed to get a photograph of Fatfoot's face, and that's what's on the cover there, is based on that photograph. That's where it came from. I think I've got it here. There you go. It's a pretty crude photo. People say, can't you do better than that? I said, you go and get your own.
Exactly. You can go get your own. That's awesome. So we've alluded to it a few times. Do you have any thoughts about the behavior of these three being so similar to what's reported with the behavior of the Bigfoot in North America?
Yeah. Because they're all intelligent. And the thing they all have in common, like us, is they've got two hands. They've got a highly developed brain, whatever it is, even a reasonable brain. They walk on two legs. That's the basic answer, because in having two hands, it means the hands have been freed from quadruped, from walking on four to walking on two, biped, and the two hands are then used to manipulate, which means they can use tools. It means that they can basically do the same as what we can do. So they're intelligent because of the fact that they have the tools, physical ability to do it, to do complex tasks. And that's probably the main reason why you would say that they're the same. The other reason is of what's called convergence. In nature, a lot of animals that are not biologically related. So, for example, your flying squirrel and our sugar glider, you have a look at them, they look pretty similar to each other, but one's a marsupial and one's a placental. One's in North America, one's in Australia. So they're on opposite sides of the planet. They've been separated from each other for who knows how many millions of years, but they still have the same physical characteristics. But more importantly, they also have the same behavioural characteristics. They behave almost identically. I did that in the book. I wrote out all the characteristics of the flying squirrel and then all the characteristics of sugar gliders, and did that with other things like the thylacine in dogs. It's convergent evolution. If an animal lives in the same environment as some other animal for a long enough period of time, they will both eventually develop or evolve techniques or physical characteristics to make them cope in that environment. So that's basically the reason why they look very similar and why they behave very similar. That's the simple answer.
It's extremely interesting. A few of my listeners might be wondering, is there a place to... Is Octopus, is it still a running organization? And is there a place to, like how we have with the BFRO, see reports that are given? Is there a public way that people can see the reports, or is it more that the reports were taken and they're not really in a public forum?
It's a closed network.
Okay.
So what happened, we didn't share it with anybody. Not a lot, but a number of these forums do it to collect data, information, swap stories, and they tend to become a little bit contentious over a period of time because people have disagreements. In the case of the Octopus, it was very congenial. There were never any problems because people would talk to each other rather than... The deadliest thing, in my opinion, is electronic communication. I think Apple and the iPhone has a lot to answer for. It's physical, face-to-face communication is the important way. So I believe in the old-fashioned methods of communicating. They have less problems. You don't have arguments. Everything is a lot smoother to operate. And that's how we operated with the Octopus. So we get people ringing up. And people did it for a simple reason, not because they wanted fame or they wanted to see how many hits they got on the website. They did it because they knew that what they were doing was making a difference. It was making a difference to some people's lives, in some cases because they'd lived through the same problem. And so by doing this, it was making life easier for those poor bastards. And also, they felt that the research being carried out was ethical. And there are a lot of ethical issues with some of these groups. Some of them I don't approve of groups that want to go out and blow them away with a gun, to just simply say they can prove it. We had that with the police here. once again, where do you stop? We had the police here. We got them in the early stages because we were very scared that no one would believe us. And then we were very scared when Merv told us that when your children could go missing. Now, I don't know how familiar any of you Americans are with the classic Australian case of the dingo taking a child's baby. But there was a case here. Sorry?
I can comment on. So I would say, I guess talking for the American culture, the most that we know about that is because it was referenced in Seinfeld back in the 90s.
There you go. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. The dingo took a child, and the woman, the mother, said it wasn't her. It was the dingo came into the tent and took a baby. They locked her up.
Wow.
They locked her up, and that was the evidence. There's no real evidence to it. And then they claimed that she must have killed the baby on circumstantial evidence. And then years later, when she was acquitted, they found out, when DNA got more sophisticated, they found out that the blood samples they had didn't match and various other things, and it wasn't her fault. She wasn't the cause of the problem. And that scared us a bit, so we thought that you need to be a little bit careful with things like that.
Absolutely. No, that makes sense. You're walking on thin ice at where.
It was the fact that we turned to get the police to help us in the early stages. We had the Aborigines, but we thought maybe we needed the police. You can imagine the police response to us saying we've got a yowie. You can probably imagine what it would have been like. They didn't believe us. And so we had a procession of people coming down to our house to experience it. I had one bloke who was particularly interesting because he had a few encounters and he thought there's something in this. And then one night, his last night down there, he came with me down to the back and I said, it's over there. You might be able to hear it. And then you could hear noises or whatever. And I said to him, look, I'm going to go and wander over it and have a chat to it. You're welcome to come. I think you'll be right as long as you come quietly and you can experience this firsthand. And he said to me, Neil, there's no way you're going to get me over there and I'm packing a gun. He said, I'm not going over there under any circumstances. So with the police, that was one of the incidents, but they all experienced the standard ridicule. So back at the police station, they had all their cartoons put up on the wall saying something about yowies, blah, blah, blah. And so it was quite traumatic for them too. But then we had the sergeant of police, a few things, and he checked out the eyes. I had a photograph of the eyes. And he looked at it and said, oh, it's a fox, mate. I said, no problem. Here's the photograph. There's the camera I took it on. There's a chair. You and the constable go and figure it out yourself. And after about 10 minutes and a lot of swearing, they came back and said, this thing's 6 foot tall. I said, that's right. He said, what is this thing? I said, you tell me. So we had that, and then the police switched over their attitude. It became, we're going to blow it away. So then they came in and said, we're going to have a stakeout, and they came in with high-powered rifles and hollow-tipped bullets and all these sorts of nasty things. And they came into our house, and I said, well, what are you doing? They said, we're going to shoot this thing. I said, no, you're not. I said, you're not going to shoot this thing for the sake of it. We don't need to prove it. And he said, don't you want this problem solved? Yeah, but not by killing the thing. This thing's really smart and it's not worth killing and you're not going to do it. And so my wife and I went and had an emergency meeting in the bedroom and then came back after a while because we decided we had big enough troubles trying to shoot it with a camera, let alone then trying to shoot it with a gun. So we thought, let's go along with this thing. So we told the police that we weren't going to cooperate and it was up to them what they did. So they went out there and they ended up talking to all the neighbours around here and they came back and said, I don't know what's going on down here, but you've got a lot of support in this valley. I said, because they're all Octopus members, that's the reason why. But what else? There's heaps of stuff on here. I think I could be here for all day doing this. So I think I thought quits at that stage.
So the area where you had all the Fatfoot encounters, even though Fatfoot is no longer with us, do you think there's still interactions with Doolighals that happen in that same area?
Yes. The reason was because on the 1st of December last year at 10:05, I had a daylight sighting of Dooligahl about 50 metres away to the north of our house, scratching a tree up. Now, that was, as we call it jokingly here, son of Fatfoot. And that was a daytime such. So the answer to that is yes. When we had Fatfoot around and very active in the early days, we'd have a lot of the neighbours involved in, I suppose you'd call it, community watch. So when we'll be outside, other neighbours would be as well, and I get telephone calls the next day. And what happened was one morning, I got a phone call from a neighbour up the road and said, "I saw you and Ian last night outside yowie hunting." I said, "Yeah, well, so what, we do it frequently." And he said, "You know you missed her." I said, "No, we didn't." He said, "Yes, you did." I said, "Okay, why did we miss Fatfoot?" And he said, "Because I saw you following her down, or heading down to the swamp, and she was up here at the top, near my place, standing behind a tree, turning, looking at me, and then looking at you two down the back." So they realised, okay, look, there's at least two. And it turned out we thought there were three. We thought that she had, understandably, Joey's little ones that she was bringing up as well. You have plenty of them around here. I mean, nature abhors a vacuum. So whenever something leaves, something else moves in behind. So when Fatfoot was getting weaker, and that was happening for the last decade or so, noticeably weaker, which even I recognised, we had Junjudee moving in behind. So we had increase in Junjudee activity as soon as Fatfoot started getting weaker, because obviously Fatfoot, being the large, powerful woman that she was, being a matriarch, she would defend her territory and included it from Junjudee. And as soon as she wasn't up to the scratch, the Junjudee moved in. So it's a standard thing. We have a lot of examples that are around in the mountains where you have, for a period of time, you have a dominant male, female, whatever, Quinkan, Junjudee, or whether it's Dooligahl, and then things seem to change, and then different characteristics and different behaviours appear, and you get different types of sightings. So it's a constant state of flux. You get, it happens, must happen everywhere in nature anyway, that sort of behaviour.
I can't wait until this episode is released, and it'll be very interesting to see what this brings in, because this is a whole new world of things. When I was reading your book the first time, I was like, this is all incredible. I can't believe I really haven't heard any of this. Over here in North America, especially the US, we have a focus right now on trying to break the genetic code of the Bigfoot. Is there anything like that going on over in Australia with these three creatures as well?
Yeah, we try to do the same thing here, of course. It's in the book as well. I talked about DNA and our attempts to try and do that. We actually got hold of 3 hair samples from a barbed wire fence down the edge of our property. And there's a photograph in the book. You can see the barb, and you can see these 3 orange hairs coming out of the wire. Now, why orange is significant is because orange is an adaptation, genetic adaptation to low light levels. Orange hair allows more light to travel through the hair to the skin to produce vitamin D. So anything with orange hair tends to come from a low light environment. Anyway, we had these 3 orange hairs, and at that time, back in the early 90s, DNA was in its infancy, and we couldn't find anyone who would analyse it for us. And the closest we came to was biological hair analysis, or microscopic hair analysis. By looking at the scales of the hairs, they can tell what type of animal it is. So we thought, we'll give that a go. So stupidly, I gave this analyst of 3 hairs. If you live and you learn, I should have only given her 1. Probably shouldn't have given her any, but I gave her 1. I gave her all 3. And when I rang up to find out what the outcome was, she just said, it's nothing. I said, well, what do you think it is? She said, I think it's a cat. I said, okay, it's a cat. Can I have my hairs back? She said, no, I threw them all in the bin. And I said, how do you throw them in the bin? I mean, they're hair samples. So I learned very early on, be very careful with any samples you do get. I was lucky enough to get, the other point about that too, microscopic hair analysis has been discredited, highly discredited by your FBI, the old FBI. The FBI has been an unreliable method of doing analysis for hairs. But anyway, the other thing I found out it's a good idea to do is to do blind samples. So if you do something like that, you don't tell them what you got beforehand, otherwise they just close down. Oh no, it's a cat hair. There's total contempt for what you're doing. A lot of people tried up here doing that, but it's really hard to get samples. I think in the early days, like with the hair, the only 3 orange hairs, which was an early day example, if you want to have evidence, you've got to get it very early on, because with our ones, as I say, they learn. And we used to always say, as we were learning from them, they were learning from us. And so anything that we show curiosity in, they would tend to be more cautious with, particularly Junjudee, but also Dooligahl, because you're dealing with a smart animal here. They're not dumb. Don't make the mistake of thinking they're just like some whatever it is. These things here are quite smart, and they react to what you do. They react quite positively to actions you take. So we learned that if you do something, you've got to do it early on. And probably the other bit of advice I'll give to American people is we used to always use passive methods. Running around the bush with a torch is not a good idea, because they very quickly learn that a flashlight will blind people, will blind them, and they don't like being blinded because they have very sensitive night vision. They learn that anything that looks like a reflector, that means like in a flashlight reflector or in a camera flash unit, anything silver reflective, turn away and don't look at it and move away from it. So they learn very quickly to avoid things like that. As I say, you got to get in early to do anything, and passive is the only way to do it. That's why recording was good, audio recording. In the early days, we used tape recorders, and the problems with tape recorders is that the batteries die with temperature decrease, and you've got probably large problems with temperature decreases. So as the temperature goes down, your batteries drop out. The other problem, of course, is sound. I used to wrap ours in tape recorder in Glad wrap in order to waterproof it, and then in a cloth around the outside of that to firmly insulate it, and also to try and deaden any sound, and then put it in a steel container and bury it in the ground with an external microphone on the outside. That was the only way to try and make a tape recorder, I'm talking about mechanical tape recorder, passive enough. But with the progression of technology over time that we were doing this, we ended up having things like, and we call them solid state drives. Now, there's no mechanical parts in that thing. It certainly doesn't produce any sound, and they're more economical with electricity, with power usage. So as soon as you had things like those sort of recorders, it was brilliant. The problem was largely solved. Light is a problem. As I said, we used to use flashes, and the problem we found out is even when we used automated flashes, the thing was that they would recognise the reflector. They would see the LEDs, so it's to tape over the LEDs. They would hear the hum of the capacitors charging up, any number of things. So we always had to think in terms of anything we did had to be passive. One thing which I used was for tracking was always a problem. How do you track passively? And the way I got around that particular problem was by using cotton thread. And I don't use standard American-made cotton thread, use Chinese cotton thread because it's very weak and it will break very quickly. And the cotton thread, I used to stretch it between trees, and then anything that passed through there would tell me that something had moved through there during the night. And by doing simple variations on having thread at different heights, you can work out not only that something was going through there, but you could work out what the height was. And to modify it even further, if you only anchored one end of the thread, when it went through and picked up the thread, it would trail it. So you then got the height of the animal, you got the fact that it went through the animal, wiped it out, and the direction it was going. So we ended up, for a very short period of time, was trying to keep track of all these threads. So we ended up having to get different coloured threads. different colours for different days or different weeks in order to differentiate between all the types of thread we had. But it worked really well as a passive method of training.
That's really smart. Yeah, I think probably some people can take and learn from that as well that are listening to this. That's super smart. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, passive is definitely the only way to go. And as I said before, you've got to get in early because they learn the same way that we do. I made a list of characteristics that explain why these things aren't hominids, aren't humans, and why they are marsupials. So a quick rundown, if you like.
Yes, please.
First of all, there's no anthropological or archaeological evidence of hominids in Australia. In other words, there's no evidence of humans in Australia before the Aborigines. So no Homo erectus, blah, blah, blah. You know that. And it's in greater detail in the book if you have the patience to go through it all. They have black claws instead of flat pinned nails. I've touched on that. The foot morphology, they've got 3, 4, and 5 toes, which makes them definitely odd. They have visible canines, fangs. Now, they're also known as the eye teeth because they descend from directly below the eyes. So if you know the canine separation, you have a close approximation of the eye separation as well. Or it can be used to confirm the photograph you've got of the eye separation by measuring off the canine measurements. But again, let's mention the book. They have long legs and they take a long stride, and consequently they're fast runners. Now, like everything that's Australian, Australia works on efficiency because if you can't make it here, you're going to die. The environment's too tough, so you can't waste energy. So long strides means you're going slow, hardly any effort, but you're traveling a big distance. I think there's a different height and body masses with these things, and also the kinetics. If you look at the way in which they move, their motion is a lot more different to human motion. They've got night vision, obviously. They have red eyes. They secrete rhodopsin on the back of the retina, or the front of the retina, which increases the sensitivity of the rods to light, which means they can see in the dark. They have, you might find this one surprising, they have a vertically slit pupil, so like a cat's eye. Now that's weird.
Wow.
Most people, when they witnesses, when they see it, they say they have black eyes. There's nothing there, like a bottomless pit. And there's a reason for that. Not only do they have black vertically slit eyes, which you need for controlling the light very accurately in day and night, it's a better method of doing it. And there's also things with regard to hunting animals at night. But we'll go into that. You have to read the book to do that. What else they got? They have a white sclera. Now, with our eyes, we have white around our pupils. The reason why is that humans are a social animal, and monkeys are, and apes are too, and Bigfoot is as well. And they're social because having a white sclera means that you can tell what you're looking at. When you move your eye off to the side, you can see you're perving at that. It means what is taking your interest. These don't have that. So they're not a social animal, which makes a lot of sense because they tend to be solitary. Also, the white sclera gives away your position at night time if you're hunting. They breathe in sync with their movement. So when they run, their breathing is in, out, in, out. That's the same thing that kangaroos have, because it doesn't make sense if you're jumping in the bush. If you're landing on the ground, you don't want to be breathing in as you're landing. You want to be exhaling. And the same as when you take off, you want to be breathing in. Now, these things tend to have a synchronized breathing pattern to them. They also pant because kangaroos, because they have trouble trying to control their body temperature, like a dog, they have to rely upon panting. And these things, if you chase them during the night time and you stress them out, you'll hear them panting like a dog in the bush. Now, I don't know many apes that do that. They're also facultative quadrupeds, which means that they walk on all 4 legs, or 2 legs and 2 arms, when they feel like it. Now, we're obligate bipeds, which means we're obligated to walk on 2 legs because it doesn't make sense using our arms. These things are facultative bipeds. They have a choice. They can run on 2 legs, which they do most of the time, because that tends to be more efficient for them. But quadruped, if they want to go super fast, they go drop to all fours and they belt along. Yeah, there's more to that. I'm not going to worry about it. What other things can I tell you? Oh, there's superhuman physical performances. They're very athletic, like kangaroos. Kangaroos used to amaze the early settlers because they could outrun the dogs that were sent on them. But then the dogs would try and run them down, and they'd just keep on going. The dogs would be panting and worn out. These things would be up on the hill waving to them, thinking, you can't get me. There's a classic example of a kangaroo that ran for, I can't remember, 8 kilometres, 5 miles. And then the dogs cornered it on a peninsula. And so rather than surrender and get killed, it jumped into the water and swam for another 2 miles and then turned around because it wasn't getting anywhere and came back before it finally got killed. And when it got killed, it puts back up against the tree to protect its back from being attacked from behind. Amazing. Their body temperature is 30% lower than placentals, so their metabolism is very low. And once again, that's a very Australian characteristic, very characteristic of marsupials, because low body temperature means greater efficiency. You don't need to eat as much food if you're burning less of it. So how I measured that was using a FLIR, or let's say a simple FLIR already. But by using this, you get a grayscale reading from 0 to 100, so it's basically a percentage. Stick it on the Mac, get colour slurp, I think I used, and hover the mouse over the pixel you're interested in, which in this case was the head, the hottest part of the marsupial, and then from that it said that this pixel was 8.9 degrees hotter than the rest, and then add the ambient temperature, so whatever the outside temperature was, and it gives you the body temperature at the surface. And in most cases here, it was about 30 degrees lower than what a placental would be. I used foxes and rats as an example to get measurements off them. Once again, you need to read it. Good self of the book. And of course, things like you got an absence of breasts. Placentals have breasts, marsupials don't because they feed from nipples inside their marsupial. I'm worn out.
That's great evidence for it being marsupial, absolutely. But man, what a conversation, Neil. My goodness. How can people pick up a copy of Fatfoot if they would like to jump into all, my goodness, let's look real quick. 715 pages.
Yeah, if they're that way inclined, then probably Amazon. Amazon, through the publisher's website, but probably Amazon would be the best way to do it. Gotcha. There's 2 versions of it because of the fact that when we printed originally in colour, I said to the publisher, I want it in colour, I want it to be half decent, I want it on decent paper and not rubbish. He printed it that way, but it came out to be very expensive. And so the end result was we did a second edition, which is lower quality paper and in black and white, which is good for it forms the function, but it's cheaper. Now, you make up your own mind when you think it's worthwhile spending the extra money, but I think it's worthwhile buying the colour version. Doesn't make any difference to me in terms of the royalty. I get the same royalty, so I'm not pushing that for that sake. But I think for your sake, it'd be better if you got the colour version. But if you haven't got the money for it, black and white, go for that one.
If there are listeners, maybe even from over in Australia, that have things that they would like to report, is there a way that they can reach out to you? Are you still actively taking reports, or?
No, not since I retired.
All right.
I still get reports, but nowhere near as many, but I'm not active in the field anymore. I've accomplished everything I wanted to accomplish. I think I've satisfied myself. I know everything about them. I'm absolutely 100% certain I know what they are, and I certainly know what they're not. And so there's not much purpose in me continuing on. So no, I haven't been doing any more research on that one. Hopefully, I've put out the call in the book for someone to take on the task. I would like Aborigines to do it themselves. because they have a lot of stories to tell and no one will say anything. They won't say anything because it's forbidden knowledge. It's knowledge that you have to be an Aboriginal or you have to be initiated or whatever the excuse is. You don't tell average people this information. So I'd like Aborigines to come out of the shell, and I'd like them to actually write about this. They'll certainly get plenty of support from me, and I'm sure a lot of other people as well.
Absolutely. I hope that does happen someday. And if listeners do have things they would like to share, they're welcome. They can always send me an email as well, bigfootsociety@gmail.com. Neil, I feel this has been a very interesting conversation. I think my listeners have learned a ton about Australia and what is going on there with the Yowie, more specifically the Dooligahl, the Quinkan, and the Junjudee. And just thank you for spending some time with us today and for sharing your years and years of research and investigation